Well, welcome everybody. This is a session about South Devon and Costa Rica in conversation, but Costa Rica has gone AWOL for a few minutes, we hope, not for long. And Melina, hopefully who lives next door to Edward, can just go bang on his front door and say, where are you?
Yeah, he's not answering my phone, so I am stepping there now.
Okay, thank you. So we agreed, Edward and I agreed that I would start. And the way we want to run this session is by getting extremely practical and back down to the ground and not being too theoretical, but just talking about what works and what doesn't work. And we know that quite a lot of people have been asking about how do you start a bioregion? What do you do? What are the different steps you can take to work at this scale? So I'm going to, in no particular order, take you through the South Devon experience to say that, well, we very passionately believe at working at bioregional scale, and we define South Devon by water, from the River Tamar in the west to the River Tein in the east, and from Dartmoor in the north, where all the rivers rise, to the sea in the south. We've ended up working at multiple different scales. So we've worked at watershed scale, we've worked at small community scale, we worked even at county scale, which is way bigger than our bioregion. And of course, we also work at international scale. So what I'm doing here now, sharing information from you and learning from all of you, is also a scale at which we work. So this ability to kind of shift scales, I think, is probably a feature of bioregional working. So one of the first things people ask us is, how do you define your bioregion? One way to do this is to develop a story of place. And developing a story of place is a very particular regenerative practice, but it's not a difficult thing to do. And in doing that, what you're doing is you're going back down through all sorts of layers, back down to the geological layer of deep time, and then working your way back up through landscape and soil and social history, economic history, land use, flora, fauna, all these different things, really kind of bringing it up to the present and understanding that there's an intricate connection between this place and the geology that shaped it and the human culture that's emerged onto it. So we talk a lot about people shaping places, and we know that humans have shaped places from the very beginning of time. Even Neanderthals shaped their places, but humans have also been shaped by places. So in a way, bioregioning is a recovery of this experience of being in a place and being shaped by it and shaping it at the same time. And of course, bioregioning is relational. So everything that we talk about bioregioning is not just about scale. It's not just about saying, well, I think my bioregion ends here or begins here. It's really about thinking about the relationships within your bioregion and that relationality and that coherence that you can sense when you're in your bioregion is the most important thing. So it's not a scientific exercise to define the edges of your bioregion. It's very much a felt thing as well as a layering up thing. So I can say when I cross over the River Tamar into Cornwall, it feels completely different. There's a different culture. The road signs are in a different language. If I go east and I go over the big hill that separates us from East Devon, again, it's entering a very different territory. So that felt sense of belonging is very important to bioregioning. So we started by developing a story of place, and we did that by looking at the history of the place and going through all the layers, as I indicated. And we did that through a short course that happened at Schumacher College in, I think it was May, June of 2016, when two people from the Regeneration Institute joined myself and John Thacker at Schumacher College, which is just up the road here in South Devon. And we did a 2-week short course in story of place and bioregioning and design. And in doing that, we unearthed some essential ingredients to this bioregion. And one of them is the commons. So the commons have existed in this bioregion of South Devon for 4,000 years, because the Bronze Age people who were invaders, this island has been invaded many times. They invaded us from the continent. They instituted a bioregional or commoning form of governance in the bioregion, particularly on Dartmoor, this kind of common grazing of cattle on the tops of the moor, and then ownership of land further down. But clearly there was a lot of commonality in the way that the land was managed and the way the land was divided up as well. So picking up on that story of the commons, we've used that a lot because this was also a place that resisted enclosure and being captured by the monarchy in the 13th century, and resisted the attempts of the kings of that time to call this whole land of Devon its hunting ground. And we work into that story because the commons today fits very closely with bioregioning. And we also say that the whole concept of the global commons, which some of you may know about, but global commons is about things like biodiversity, forests, healthy seas, healthy landscapes, healthy soil, all of these things are global commons. That stewarding that at local level is an aspect of bioregioning. And so we use this very powerful story to help people imagine themselves into how we can do that here. And that's, I think, a very important ingredient. When you're first starting, don't imagine that you're going to bring in a set package from outside. You're going to be exploring on your ground, on your territory, understanding who your territory is, how it functions, and what is happening here now. So in terms of what is happening now in Devon, about 4 years ago, many of the local communities here that are organized into town councils, parish councils, regional councils, Devon County Council, declared climate emergency. And so we work into that rather than just saying we need to change the whole system. We meet people where they are. We work with the existing system, whether it's talking to people in business or communities on the land or farmers or fishermen. We work with the challenges they have. And those include things like ownership of land and how that's organized. It includes kind of legal constraints around fishing. It's about how do you work with the system in order to bend the system towards being more regenerative, and always kind of telling this bigger story about how everything connects up and creating these relationships between different communities, between different sectors and so on. So one way in which we have been creating connections between communities is a recent project that we did on our local river, which we did with funding from our water company, Southwest Water, which was in the first instance, it was about saving water, understanding the impact of climate change on fresh water supplies and how communities could respond to that. So how could communities design into a regenerative water future? So what data would they need to know? We went and talked to climate scientists and they came and helped us, and we talked to people in environmental conservation and they helped us. But we also were very interested in what the communities themselves knew about water and climate change. And we brought in the arts, and as well as bringing in data at different scales to help these people in the communities to understand what the impact of climate change was going to be, but also to give them a sense of their own agency. So how could they take responsibility for their own future? So that's one thing that we did recently. We also did something else recently called the Devon Doughnut. So some of you will know about Doughnut Economics and analysis at that scale. We found that extremely helpful to do. We always knew that we needed some kind of baseline for our bioregion from which to work. We were never quite sure we wanted to go down the Doughnut route, but there was an event online in Devon that took place in July 2020, I think it was, which had so much energy around Doughnut Economics and people saying, we just want to do this for Devon, that we stepped forward as an organization and said, well, we're just going to hold this and let's see where it goes. And we called together a collective of people who over the course of a whole year met fortnightly in Zoom sessions because it was still the pandemic. And also Devon is a very big county. And we together designed the Doughnut for Devon and said we wanted a people's doughnut. We wanted to make it contextual. We wanted to be able to understand how all these different ways of measuring applied to our place. So for those of you who don't know about the Doughnut, it is a fusing of the Stockholm Resilience Centre's planetary boundaries model, which is looking at where we're overshooting. So we're overshooting, for instance, in land conversion. So land conversion to being built on, i.e. losing land that is either fields or able to be cultivated in some way, losing it to hard surfaces, We're also overshooting in terms of chemical cycles like the nitrogen and phosphorus cycle, which is highly polluting to our rivers and our oceans. We're also losing, of course, in biodiversity. So in Melina, thank you for telling me, Isabel, Edward's not at home and is offline. So we'll just keep going. Maybe we can reschedule the Costa Rica conversation at some time next week in the summit. So I'm going to keep going and just talk about South Devon and hopefully kind of raise issues you might all want to explore with me. So on the outer ring of the donut, you've got the Stockholm Resilience Centre's planetary boundaries and this sense of there is dangerous overshoot happening in ocean acidification, for instance. But we knew that in South Devon, ocean acidification is a very abstract thought, that it's hard for people to feel any kind of ownership or connection to that. And so we called it marine health. And marine health is something that people, when they go down to the sea, or they go out on boats, or they take their children to the beach, they can really connect to that. And they can kind of see what's happening at the shoreline. And they know that there are ways in which they can take some responsibility for that, and organizations that they can join. So on the outer ring, the planetary boundaries, on the inner ring, the sustainable development goals, i.e. the threshold below which we should not fall if everyone in our society is going to be able to flourish. And in terms of regenerative development and design, that flourishing is essential. Without that ability to flourish, it's very hard for anyone to take action and become part of any kind of project that's going to shift the needle on any of the indicators that we worked into for the Devon Doughnut. So the Devon Doughnut was a way to open up a very big conversation across our county about the kind of future that people wanted to see. I won't say a whole lot more about that because there's a whole website dedicated to it, which Roger's very kindly put in the chat. And again, everything that we've done in South Devon, we have charted on our Bioregional Learning Centre website. So you're able to go to that and pick up on the resources for that. So what are we doing now? We created our story of place. In 2019, we led a learning journey around South Devon. We went to 4 different places and we had a water resilience summit for people all over the southwest of England to attend. Those 4 places that we traveled to with a whole bunch of people and met people when we got to those places who were doing work on the ground. So we had one day which was all about the local area and about food and food systems. We went to our local supermarket, we went and visited farms, we went and talked to Riverford, which some of you will have heard of, which is a very big organic farm, which has a big organic vegetable box distribution scheme. And we learned what people were doing on the ground and what was concerning them and how they were taking action. And we also went to Plymouth, which is where Sonia is. And we talked to people who were working with communities, growing food. And we visited a lot of different social enterprises who presented to us. And we went to see a community energy generation project, which was about solar panels and communities owning the revenue from those solar panels in order to build health centers in their community to help with obesity and loneliness and things like that. We also went up to Dartmoor and we had somebody from Southwest Water talk to us about our reservoir and how that was functioning. And we talked to local farmers up on the moor about their situation with climate change and how many of them are promoting biodiversity by recovering what we call moor meadows. So moor meadows are turning meadows over from being grass pasture for cattle back to how they always used to be, with many, many different plants on them, which if you just leave the meadows alone, just come back on their own in an extraordinary way. And you can really, when you step into one of those meadows, you can hear the hum of insect life and you can feel what regeneration really feels like. So this is something else we're trying to do. It's give people experiences of what does regeneration really feel like. So it could be a social enterprise that's working in a big city, or it could be a moor meadow. There are many different ways to give those experiences. So that learning journey really showed us where the green shoots of resilience are, and it enabled us to build those connections that are so important, connections with people who are doing the work on the ground, but also the other people who came along with us on that learning journey from different communities who we're still in touch with, and many of whom have been inspired to take action through that learning journey. So that was a kind of mapping exercise, I suppose you could call it. And then from there, we did projects on the ground, a lot to do with water. We worked with water extensively. And one of those projects was about finding a way to give rights to our local river. So we wanted to give our river, we knew we couldn't give our river legal rights. It's just not possible in this country to do that. But we did find a way to give our river moral rights. And we created a charter for our local river, which gives right to the river to flow from source to sea, to not be polluted, to support a healthy ecosystem. And we put communities into the role of upholding those rights. And again, if you go to our website, you'll be able to see what the community charter for a river, or the river charter itself, looks like. And we are handing that on to other rivers that want to use that. And we're working upstream and downstream. And that in itself is a very good way of building community. So building community, I think, is done extremely well through projects. It's done less well through abstraction and kind of thinking about how you might create conversations. But if everybody is working together on something very specific, it's a very powerful way to build community. So we've done that. And what we're doing now, having done that work on the ground for the past 5 years and built many, many different relationships. And I must say, the Devon Doughnut work was an amazing way to build relationships. We connected with 170 people from all walks in Devon, from Devon County Council to regional councils, to parish councils, to community groups, to NGOs, non-government organizations, some people in business, not very many, but some people in academia. And all of those people themselves represent organizations or networks. And so we had fantastic conversations, cross-pollination between all of those different people. And we're going to be reviving that, because what we want to do next is to create what we're temporarily calling a Center for Systems in Action. Because what we feel is really needed now is the ability of communities, especially, and we put civil society into the middle of everything that we do at the moment, and have been doing for the last 5 years. We feel that civil society is an absolutely essential piece of the jigsaw puzzle if we're going to build climate resilience. We want to create some kind of center that is civil society facing, that is empowering for them to collect the data, the information, the narratives that they need in order to be able to understand what is going on in their places, and to also have connection to examples from around the world of things that work. So stories, really, stories about what's working in Costa Rica, what's working in South Africa, what's working around the world, so that they can be inspired by that. But we also want to be able to support them in order to design their own processes. So design is a very important element of this. And we're putting a lot of emphasis on learning. So learning faster than the rate of climate change is, for us, a kind of non-negotiable equation. With global ecosystems or geosystems on the move, the polar ice caps melting, the Gulf Stream faltering, all of these different things happening at once, our ability to adapt is very much linked to our capacity to adaptively learn. And we want to create a center for adaptive learning. We're not quite sure what it looks like yet, so we're in lots of big conversations about what people think is needed and where do we go next. So I'm going to pause there. It's past. I see there are a few questions in the chat, but I'm very happy to open this out to the floor and for you to ask questions. Maybe I'll start with Claire's question while all of you have a think about what you want to ask. How do you tell the bioregional story at the different scales, on the ground through projects, at municipal level through policy, infrastructure, narrative, county and federal? So we stick to the same essential story. We stick to the story of how Devon has been able to adapt and change in the past. We promote a story that's very like a can-do story, a very positive story. We talk about potential. So that story about the commons and how the people of Devon resisted enclosure by the monarchy, that they were able to organize themselves, that they were able to institute commoning practices on Dartmoor, is a very important story that works at lots of different levels. So that's one important story that we tell. And another is the story of connection. So ways in which people have always connected. South Devon in particular is organized in river valleys. So it's through river valleys that people got to know each other. And it still is the way in which people connect today. So we're going to know many more people in our own valley than people in the adjacent valleys. So this kind of longitudinal stretch from the sea up to the moor really mirrors the way in which trade used to happen certainly from medieval times onwards and even before, but also the way farming practices worked. So the way that farmers would have pasture in the south part, so near to the sea, in their valley during the winter time. And then in the summertime, they'd move their cattle and sheep and up to the moor. And as some of you know, there are also wild ponies on the moor. So there's a lot of kind of wild, free roaming livestock on Dartmoor. And that is one of the ways in which the commons shows up today. Do put up your hand if you'd like to ask a question or just say something. Yeah, Amanda. You can't talk. Keep you eating, and
I was just eating something. I apologise. So I'm in Devon actually, but I'm in one of those other regions in East Devon.
Great.
And but I'm really interested in how you've gone about this and how you think that changing the narrative has really mobilised people differently. Because I work in the community setting. We've done a lot around our culture and just sort of enabling people to think differently about some of these really big issues that kind of paralyze people because they just seem so huge. And I wondered if you'd managed to sort of shift the narrative and people's thinking and behaviours around that with this approach.
Well, to give you the example of the Devon Doughnut, so what we wanted to do was to work into the space of possibility. And we were getting people all the time to imagine, how could we do this better? How could we revitalize our economy and ecology? What would it take? And then we broke it down. So the way the Doughnut works, it's segmented. So one segment is coastal marine health, another segment is income and work, for instance. Another segment is to do with land use change. Another one is to do with, let me think, I always forget them, but another one is to do with kind of water as it's consumed by humans. So you kind of break it down into segments. Then for each segment, we had in-depth conversations about what would it take to shift the needle on one scenario in that segment in such a way that if you could do that, it would shift the whole segment. And so we worked down into the different scenarios. So what would be the scenarios, for instance, for coastal marine health? And we got the Brixham Harbour Master to come and talk to us because we had an idea that what we wanted to do was to get all the fishing boats that go out from Brixham Harbour to stop using bottom dredging as a way of fishing. So kind of dragging their nets along the bottom of the sea. We knew that bottom dredging emits as much carbon dioxide as aviation does each year. So we wondered if we could kind of intervene in that way. And he came and talked to us and said, you can't do that. It's going to be counterproductive. You're going to start alienating all the fishermen. You need to make friends with them. Why don't you do it a different way? Why don't you look at kind of creating more highly protected marine areas, which is not necessarily an easy thing to do, but we put that in as one of the actions that we wanted to take, knowing that to the north of Devon, there's an island called Lundy, which has a highly protected marine area, which is showing tremendous kind of benefits from having it being protected. A lot of sea life is returning to that area. So for each, I think drilling down and getting very practical and looking at pathways to action and naming what they are. And we also segmented those pathways to action into the one hand, we had policymakers, and within policymakers, we lumped together government. So Devon County Council, which is our kind of big regional council, but also, of course, in the case of coastal marine health, it goes up to Westminster, it goes up to even kind of cross-channel bodies who are the policymakers. So it's not just confining ourselves to policymakers based in Devon. And then on the other side of the pathways to action, we had civil society. So what action would civil society take? And we recognize that there's a role in the middle to do that kind of bridge, hold that bridging space between the two, which is what Bioregional Learning Center does a lot of the time. So enabling policymakers to talk to civil society and civil society to talk to government, for instance, we feel is a really essential function. And it's not necessarily a function that people think about an awful lot when they think about bioregions, but we're concentrating in South Devon on building that connective tissue more than doing projects. Claire, your hand is up.
Yeah, so this is actually very related to Amanda's question, and you're actually sort of covering a bit of it, but I'm going to ask in a slightly, it is a different way. I can see why strategic areas of action are really important for, for identifying and sort of putting into practice what you're trying to move forward. But it seems to me that the bioregional approach is really, there's a lot of making what is invisible visible. And so much has been left out in terms of, and has no agency. And so there's systemic things that continue to keep those pieces invisible. And I'm wondering, I'm really sort of, this is the thing I keep coming back to, because it's very hard to create the conditions for moving forward more effectively without advocating for that scaffolding. And one of the areas I sort of see is basic organizational governance is one thing, but maybe ongoing support. There was a program in Alberta, Canada, where they had a board development program, and it was a train the trainer program. And basically they would go and visit communities, work with them, and it would be a kind of once every year or 2 years. But it kept a level of health in those organizations that just was missing in other parts of the country. Anyway, I just wondered about more that systemic piece of supporting what, if we're going to change, making visible what has been left invisible, well, how do we get at that? So,
yeah, that's a lovely question. So making systems visible, making landscapes visible, no longer seeing them as parceled out between the landowners, but enabling conversations to happen across landscapes and collective decision making about how those landscapes are regenerated. That's definitely part of the work. But we think that it's best done through creating examples. So you could say bioregions are islands of coherence in some way, but we also think that connecting up all the regenerative farming projects, or connecting up all the different kind of social enterprises that are focused on regeneration, or convening conversations where business comes into connection with community groups or different parts of the social system in Devon, and enabling them to talk to each other and to understand they're all part of the same system. They all have different roles within the same system. So I guess that goes back to being the connective tissue, enabling the connective tissue and performing this kind of bridging role. A lot of what we do is quite subtle in the sense that we'll take on a project, but we'll kind of subtly subvert the project and make sure that through doing the project, people do start to see the whole system and do start to understand. So for instance, that project we did called Voices of the Dart, which was with local communities about saving water, using less water, we were also asking the question, if water could speak, what would it say? And through asking that question, we were activating a different part of people's brains, but we were also bringing our water company into the room and making it possible for the community groups to understand the kind of bind that water companies find themselves in. So on the one hand, they are public companies, they have shareholders, they have to create a return on their business. So that means they need to sell more water. On the other hand, they're being constrained by the fact that there just isn't as much water available now, and certainly won't be in the future. So they have to tell people to use less water. And then they've got a national regulator that is telling them they've got to maintain water supplies at current levels for the next 50 years, which is an impossibility. So they find themselves in that kind of difficult situation. So then rather than throwing brickbats at the water companies, we generated a much better kind of conversation in which we did start to open up, like, what is the governance structure of Southwest Water? What is preventing it from becoming a publicly owned company, not through shareholders, but really kind of seeing water as a common pool resource? So it's through creating those situations where you can bring different players together and then facilitating them in such a way that all the voices are heard, that I think you start to see systemically, not just a whole river valley and how river and waters are essential to life, but also how the human systems interact with the natural systems. Does that make sense? Great. Jan or Jan.
Thanks, it's Jan. It's so great to hear the stories of Devon, and because I took a master's at Schumacher College, and so was around there a lot, and then I went on and did my PhD in the Commons because I was so steeped in that awareness there. But I'm back in Canada, and I'm translating the concept of commons, because in the new world the commons isn't the same, and also we have Indigenous people who are have been very active here up until 200 years ago. And so it's like taking that concept and working with that. So that's just one reflection I'm having about what you're saying. But the question specifically that I had is that so much of the gathering of data and information about region, whether it's ecologically or waterways or socially, is done by experts who are paid, and they're a bit siloed, and then we have community people who, through the story of place, are gathering a more coherent understanding of information, and wanting to own and use that, but they're not paid. So there's that inequity of what is seen as being valuable that just even happens when people come to a meeting. So maybe some of the experts are paid to gather the people, but there's this right in the room, there's that issue of the inequity. And I'm very curious as to how you navigate that so that there is a sense that the community actually, they are the experts, and they are the ones who really should be in charge and stewarding the river, et cetera, et cetera. But then the reality is that the monies is all being gone and saying the experts, the individual experts are the ones that really are important. So I'm curious as to how you navigate that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jan. So go back to the water example. So here in the UK, we have an agency called the Environment Agency, which is charged with monitoring our waterways and making sure that they're clean, and monitoring overflows of sewage into the water and legislating for that. However, they're desperately underfunded. They don't have enough feet on the ground. So there's that issue there. The Environment Agency knows that they need to work more closely with communities to be the eyes and ears on the water and report back to them. And another issue is that, and this is the way we talk about it, is about agency. So you were kind of talking to that, really, kind of who has agency, who has the power, who has the money, who has the expertise, and so on. But in our what's happening in the world today with kind of Gaia on the move, I feel in many ways the agency is with Gaia. And the sooner we all recognize that, the sooner we'll kind of stop squabbling about who has agency on the ground, because we all need to be able to find our agency, and we all have different roles. It's not that one role is more important than another role, but in learning how to adapt and respond to climate change, finding our own agency, seeing that we're all part of a bigger system in our place. You know, bioregions are just a very useful way of defining systems in a way. It's kind of a boundary for systems within which you can tell a coherent story. And this really helps. So kind of looking at the biggest framing, to me, always helps. Kind of cutting people down to size is definitely the wrong phrase to use here, but it helps everyone feel we're all in the same space and we somehow need to work together. So then it comes back again to thinking about, how do we do that working together? What are our different roles? How do we stay connected? That's kind of how we manage that one. So I am seeing a question here from Trisha Regenerosa, Costa Rica, to share the story of the Bioregional Learning Center in Devon. What are the essential components of a bioregional learning center for any bioregion? So thank you very much, Trisha. On our website, in the blog posts, the Bioregional Learning Center website, I've been writing a series of blogs that share with everybody the thinking behind the Bioregional Learning Center. And we were hugely inspired by Donella Meadows. And some of you may have heard already that Donella Meadows started something called the Balaton Group in around 1980. It was a group of people who they called together around Lake Balaton in Hungary, who were talking about how to make change happen on the ground. And they were scientists, and they were what was called cybernetics experts or systems experts. There weren't so many kind of people working at community scale that I can see. But anyway, at that time, Donella wrote a paper about bioregions and learning centers. And we have been hugely inspired by that. And what she said was that there is a real need for each bioregion to have a center that functions as, has many different functions, but it's able to act as a kind of an exchange between different people. It's able to collect up the know-how on the ground and apply that to solving problems on the ground. It's able to act as a kind of broadcast station and tell people what they're doing. It's also able to collect data and share data and use that data to put in place almost like a kind of parallel governance system for your place. And when I think about parallel governance systems, I'm also looping back to the global commons and the idea of us kind of stewarding water, stewarding soil, stewarding biodiversity. And that's not something that can just be left to experts. How do we all do that? How do we collect the information that enables us to do that, kind of empowers us to do that, but informs what we do as well? And then she also said, within that bioregional learning center, you've got people with really good hearts who are able to understand how to work with many different people. So able to speak to government, able to speak to farmers, able to speak to academics, able to speak with people working in social housing. So again, it's that bridging role. But if you go to the blog posts, you'll see that I have taken a lot of that, what was then an unpublished paper by Donella Meadows, and put it into one of the blogs. And I'm pretty confident that the Systems Institute, which Donella founded, has now put that whole paper into its resource section in its website. I haven't actually gone to take a look, but Marta Cerroni said that she was planning to do that. So you should be able to get it from there. And I encourage you all to read it. It's really inspiring. And we feel that learning is absolutely essential to everything that we do. We're certainly not coming at this with a sense that we know everything, we know what to do, we figured it all out. We think that we can just kind of take models from elsewhere and impose them here. We're very resistant to that. We want people in this place to develop their own models and to co-design what they want to do together. Again, working into this space for revitalization or regeneration. So we do have an end goal. We imagine what this place would look like if it was revitalized. What would we see happening? What are the steps towards that? And so there's many more things I could say about bioregions and bioregioning. What does bioregioning mean? And we'll go deeper into that when I have conversations with Daniel Christian Wahl and John Thackara next week. So I'll pause on that for now and turn to Killian, who's put his hand up.
Hi, I want to be careful not to come off as challenging the model that your group is pursuing or anything like that, or saying, oh, why don't you change to this? But I do have some thoughts about this, in that in this day and age, with the technology we have and all these things, and looking at the models that we find in indigenous cultures of distributed networks, which is now being modeled as distributed networks in the modern world electronically, which is interesting because those networks are pretty consumptive, which is really weird. But I wonder if there's not space to consider that maybe updating Donnella's thinking to match the distributed world we can create today. That maybe what we could consider is that each community is a node, and those that center of knowledge can actually be distributed rather than centralized. It's just a thought. It's how I think I ideally would want my bioregion to develop, but I'm open to either one, and so I don't mean it as a challenge. So I want to be clear about that.
Thank you, Killian. I'm not taking it as a challenge because I think that's a very good observation, and it's the direction we're heading in, for sure. We're not saying we are the repository for all the information. We do recognize that there is a need for a place of exchange and bridging and sharing and making meaning. But no, absolutely. I mean, Devon is quite extraordinary in the sense that there are many distributed autonomous organizations already in existence here, that many people before I ever arrived here 12 years ago have been doing the work of kind of tilling the soil, introducing regenerative practices and ideas. But there is a need to connect it all up. And I guess that's the role that the bioregion can play. Doing it at county scale seems too big. So we would much rather do it at bioregional scale. And the way we're heading now is to somehow kind of map ourselves onto the adaptation plan that's currently emerging for Devon, Cornwall and the Scilly Isles, and to figure out how we can work with what's already going on at that kind of government scale and that level of need and responding to need, and bring it back down to bioregional scale and say, what would it look like if both Devon and Cornwall and the Scillies had their own bioregional learning centers and we were all connected? So how would that function? What do people actually need for adaptation to happen? We would want to provide the learning element of that, but also in creating islands of coherence, really kind of pulling together all the great examples of what's already going on and encouraging people to do more of that.
So if I may ask a follow-up, in the regenerative governance model that I proposed like 2011, it is a fractal model of egalitarian decision making, right? Where decision making isn't hierarchical, but it's at scale. And so maybe that is actually matching up. Maybe that's what maybe we're talking about the same thing, where some things need to be. So what aspects of decision making or knowledge would you consider need to be at that meta level versus the neighborhood or small community level? So do you have any sense of what that fractalness would be?
I think there's a need to work at these different scales, absolutely. Just go back to water, for instance. The River Charter gives responsibility to communities to take care of their water, to be the eyes and ears of the water, to collect information, to be part of a citizen science program that currently exists. But also there needs to be a way to feed that information back up to Southwest Water. So again, it's that dialogue between the policymakers and civil society, which enables shifts and changes to happen and for resource to be allocated much more to the grassroots level. But I I think governance is incredibly important because kind of slightly undercover, we feel there's a need to build parallel governance structures. We don't think our current governance structures are going to serve us for an awful lot longer. But the ability of local people to see what's going on in terms of what's happening to our water supply, what's happening to biodiversity, what's happening to soil, all of these things, which are part of the global commons, I think that's going to become more and more urgent. And this kind of fragmentation that we think probably will happen. England is the most centralized state in Europe, or the UK is the most centralized state in Europe. We don't think it can hold the center for a whole lot longer in the face of what's happening in terms of climate change and the various kinds of collapse that we're beginning to see. So if this fragmentation breaks down into county level, and we're already positioned there with bioregional learning centers, we're able to kind of pick up on this capacity of the local communities to step in and be part of future governance. So Roger, the last question comes from you.
Thank you so much for this. This has been so chock full of information and practicality. I really love it. And this is kind of a segue from Killian's thing, thinking about governance and the commons. And I'm wondering, have you found any use in David Bowyer's, and I can't remember her name, she was German, the triad of the commoning, the triad of the commons?
Yeah, you're talking about Silke Helfrey.
Yeah. And Free, Fair, and Alive book. And that also gets into governance, and sociocracy can be a part of that, which scales and is polycentric. So I was just wondering if you could chat about that.
Yeah, so you probably know that very sadly Silke died about a year ago. She had a very bad accident. But David and I and somebody called Christine Dunn from New Zealand are having a conversation next week in the summit, talking about all of these things, because we feel that commoning is a vital part of bioregioning. I mean, bioregions and bioregioning are such a new thing. You know, these conversations at this scale have really been going on for the last 5 years. And of course, there were all those conversations back in the 1960s and 1970s, Northwest Pacific Coast and so on. Now there's been a resurgence, and we're still trying to define what bioregioning looks like. But bioregions are not neutral. They have they're becoming to kind of pull together a very defined set of practices and a defined ethos as well. And I've said before in this summit that we find ourselves at a slightly kind of fragile moment when we're putting bioregions out there, but we're still defining and finding the language and understanding what people find useful and what they don't find useful. So it's that kind of ongoing process, but commoning, I think, is a very vital ingredient.
And life is an evolutionary prototype.
Totally. So we're with that. Always asking questions, not saying we know it all.
Right. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Oh, pleasure. And this is being recorded. So if anyone wants to come back in, Amanda, I'm going to connect to you. Absolutely, definitely. Let me just quickly put my email in here right now to everybody. So if you want to email me, you can. There we go. So there we go. Thank you so much for being here. I'm somebody who finishes on time. I think people need to be able to get to their next session. So, but there'll be lots of opportunities in the next week to keep talking about all of this. And thank you so much for being here and all the great questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Incredible.